Somewhere over occupied France in the winter of 1944, the sky split apart with cannon fire. A young American fighter pilot, barely 23 years old, watched his instrument panel shatter as 20-millimeter rounds tore through the engine cowling of his P-51 Mustang. Smoke poured into the cockpit, thick and black, and the aircraft shuddered violently as the Merlin engine seized. According to mission reports from the 8th Air Force, dozens of escort pilots were lost over France during that brutal winter. But what happened next to this particular pilot would become one of the most extraordinary escape stories of the entire war. He'd been flying top cover for a bomber formation, heading toward industrial targets deep inside occupied territory. The mission had gone smoothly until a squadron of Focke-Wulf 190s emerged from cloud cover at 11 o'clock high, diving with terrifying speed. The American pilot managed to down one of them before a second fighter raked his aircraft from tail to nose. With his engine on fire and hydraulic fluid spraying across the windscreen, he had no choice. He yanked the canopy release, rolled the dying Mustang inverted, and dropped into the frozen air at 18,000 feet. The parachute opened with a violent jerk that nearly knocked him unconscious. Below, the French countryside stretched out in a patchwork of brown fields and dark forests, dusted with frost. He could see a small village to the east, smoke curling from chimneys, and to the west, what appeared to be a grass airfield, with several aircraft parked along its edge. As he drifted down, the cold gnawing through his flight suit, he began to calculate. The village meant civilians, possible resistance contacts, but the airfield meant Germans, patrols, and almost certain capture. He landed hard in a frozen beet field, the impact sending a shock of pain through his left ankle. He gathered his parachute quickly, stuffing the silk into a drainage ditch and covering it with mud and dead vegetation. His survival training kicked in immediately: evade, orient, move at night. But as he crouched behind a hedgerow, catching his breath, he noticed something that changed everything. The airfield was closer than he had estimated, no more than 800 meters away, and sitting at the far end of the grass strip, partially concealed beneath camouflage netting, was a Focke-Wulf 190, the very type of aircraft that had just shot him down. If you are enjoying this story, take a moment to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It helps us bring you more incredible stories like this one. Now, let us continue. According to historical accounts compiled after the war, the airfield was a satellite dispersal field used by the Luftwaffe to protect their fighters from Allied bombing raids on major bases. These small strips, often little more than packed earth or mowed grass, were scattered across northern France and typically guarded by only a handful of ground crew and a small security detachment. The pilot, hiding in the tree line as dusk settled over the countryside, watched the airfield for hours. He counted the personnel, fewer than a dozen men, most of them mechanics who disappeared into a farmhouse that served as their quarters once darkness fell. A single sentry walked the perimeter with a rifle slung over his shoulder, his pace slow and predictable. The pilot had flown against the Focke-Wulf 190 for months. He knew its silhouette, its performance characteristics, its reputation as one of the finest fighters the Luftwaffe had produced. The radial engine variant, the 190A, was powered by a BMW 801 14-cylinder engine producing nearly 1,700 horsepower. It was fast, rugged, and, crucially, it had a wide-track landing gear that made it forgiving on rough fields. What he did not know was whether that particular aircraft was fueled, armed, or even operational. But the alternative was weeks of evasion through occupied territory in winter. With a swelling ankle and limited supplies, the risk of capture was enormous either way. He waited until well past midnight. The temperature had dropped below freezing, and his breath came in thin, white clouds. The sentry had retreated to the farmhouse, likely driven inside by the bitter cold. The pilot moved low across the frozen field, staying close to the hedgerows, his heart pounding so hard he could feel it in his temples. Every sound seemed amplified in the stillness: the crunch of frost beneath his boots, the distant bark of a dog, the creak of a wooden gate swinging in the wind. When he reached the aircraft, he ran his hands over the fuselage in the darkness. The metal was ice cold, slick with condensation. He found the handhold on the left side of the fuselage and pulled himself up onto the wing root, his injured ankle screaming in protest. The cockpit canopy was closed, but not locked. He slid it back carefully, wincing at the metallic scrape that seemed deafening in the silence. Inside, the cockpit smelled of oil, leather, and something faintly chemical, probably hydraulic fluid. The instrument panel was entirely in German, but the basic layout was familiar enough. Throttle on the left, stick in the center, rudder pedals on the floor. He had studied captured enemy aircraft during intelligence briefings back in England, and several Allied pilots had already test-flown the WWII at evaluation centers. The starting procedure was different from the Mustang, but the fundamental principles of flight were universal. He found the fuel selector and checked the gauges. The tank showed roughly half full, enough for perhaps 300 miles under optimal conditions. The channel was approximately 150 miles to the northwest. It was possible, barely. The BMW 801 engine had an automatic engine management system, one of the most advanced of its era. Unlike Allied engines that required constant manual adjustment of fuel mixture, propeller pitch, and boost pressure, the Commando Garret handled most of these functions automatically. This was a stroke of luck the pilot could not have anticipated. It meant that even with limited familiarity, he could get the engine running and manage it in flight, without the intricate knowledge a Luftwaffe pilot would have developed over months of training. He primed the engine, set the fuel mixture, and pressed the starter. The BMW 801 coughed, turned over twice, and then caught with a deep, thundering roar that shattered the silence of the French night. Lights snapped on in the farmhouse immediately. He could see figures stumbling out into the darkness, shouting in German, their voices carrying across the frozen field. There was no time for a proper warm-up. He released the brakes and pushed the throttle forward, and the Focke-Wulf began to roll, slowly at first, then gathering speed across the grass strip. The tail came up, the aircraft bouncing over the uneven ground, and then with a final lurch, he was airborne, climbing into the black sky with the engine howling at full power. Behind him, small arms fire crackled uselessly into the darkness. He was already out of effective range, climbing through 500 feet and banking hard to the northwest. The night was overcast, with a solid layer of cloud at around 3,000 feet, and he pushed up into it gratefully, letting the gray murk swallow the aircraft. In the clouds, he was invisible. He leveled off, reduced power to a cruise setting, and tried to steady his breathing. His hands were shaking, not from cold anymore, but from the raw adrenaline flooding his system. The next challenge was navigation. He had no maps for this aircraft, no radio frequencies for Allied controllers, and the compass markings were in German format. But he knew the general heading, northwest to the Channel, then across to England. The overcast worked in his favor for concealment, but made celestial navigation impossible. He flew by compass and dead reckoning, adjusting for the wind that buffeted the aircraft from the southwest. After approximately 40 minutes of flight, he descended below the cloud layer and saw the dark expanse of the English Channel stretching out beneath him, the water black and featureless under the overcast sky. Relief flooded through him, but it was immediately replaced by a new and terrifying realization. He was approaching England in a German fighter aircraft. Every anti-aircraft battery along the southern coast would identify him as hostile. Every RAF night fighter on patrol would see an enemy silhouette. He had no way to communicate his identity, no IFF transponder, and no recognition signals. As he crossed the coastline, the flak began. Streams of tracer fire arced up from the darkness below, red and orange lines reaching toward him like burning fingers. He threw the aircraft into a violent series of evasive maneuvers, diving, climbing, banking hard left and right as explosions bracketed the Focke-Wulf. Shrapnel rattled against the fuselage like hail on a tin roof. He pushed the nose down, trading altitude for speed, and roared across the English countryside at treetop level, the hedgerows and church steeples flashing past in the darkness. At this altitude, the anti-aircraft guns had difficulty tracking him, and the firing gradually fell behind. He found an airfield by its flare path, a line of dim lights marking a runway. He had no idea whether it was RAF, USAAF, or even operational, but his fuel gauges were touching empty and his options had run out. He dropped the landing gear, feeling the reassuring thump as the wheels locked down, slowed the aircraft, and lined up on the lights. The landing was rough, the Focke-Wulf bouncing twice on the unfamiliar runway before settling, and he let it roll to a stop at the far end of the strip. Within seconds, vehicles surrounded the aircraft, headlights blazing, and armed personnel approached with weapons drawn. He raised his hands above the cockpit rail and shouted that he was American, his voice hoarse and cracking. According to accounts that circulated among Allied air crews after the incident, there was a tense standoff as ground personnel struggled to reconcile the sight of a man in an American flight suit sitting in the cockpit of a German fighter. It took several hours of interrogation before his identity was confirmed through his unit and service records. The Focke-Wulf 190 was later handed over to an RAF evaluation unit, where it provided valuable intelligence on German fighter capabilities. The pilot, after treatment for his ankle injury and a period of debriefing, eventually returned to flying duties. According to fellow pilots who served alongside him, he rarely spoke about that night in detail. When pressed, he would simply say that desperation makes a man capable of things he would never otherwise attempt, and that the cold French darkness had given him no choice but to try. Stories like this one remind us that war often produced moments of extraordinary individual courage, born not from fearlessness, but from the simple refusal to accept capture or defeat. The pilot who climbed into an enemy cockpit on a frozen night in France did not know whether the engine would start, whether the fuel was sufficient, or whether he would be shot down by his own side. He only knew that the alternative was worse, and sometimes that is enough.